The story most people were taught about World War II fits neatly into a shape. There were nations that stood for something, nations that had abandoned every principle that civilization claimed to value, and somewhere between them, a line that separated the acceptable from the monstrous. That shape is a comfort. It is also, when examined closely, a construction. Not a lie exactly, but something more unsettling than a lie. A frame. A deliberate decision about which facts to make visible and which to allow to recede. What recedes, when you stop holding the frame in place, is not a different war. It is the same war, fought by the same people, with the same weapons, producing the same dead. But the machinery that produced it looks different when you stop insisting that only one side operated the machinery. This is not a story about moral equivalence. Some things that happened in this war were categorically worse than others, and the historical record is not ambiguous about that. What is worth examining is something else entirely. It is the question of how institutions function when the humans inside them have decided, or been told, or simply come to assume, that the rules which normally govern behavior have been suspended. It is the question of what happens when bureaucratic efficiency and moral collapse occupy the same office building, share the same filing cabinets, and sign off on the same paperwork. Because that is what this war was, at its operational core. Not chaos, not madness, not the breakdown of civilization. It was civilization functioning exactly as designed, in service of objectives that could not survive public scrutiny. The first thing that disappears when you look at this war without the frame is the idea that the killing was always personal. Most of it was not. Most of the people who processed the decisions that ended other people's lives never saw those lives end. They sat at desks. They reviewed forms. They approved allocations. They signed requisitions for materials whose ultimate purpose they understood perfectly well and did not discuss in those terms. The distance between the person who made a decision and the person who suffered its consequences was often enormous, and that distance was not accidental. It was engineered. Systems were built specifically so that the human cost of a decision could be absorbed somewhere downstream, by someone else, in a place that did not appear on the document being signed. This was true in Germany, where the bureaucratic machinery of mass murder operated with a thoroughness that still astonishes historians who study it. The transportation logs, the supply chains, the personnel records, the official correspondence that referred to human beings in the language of inventory management. The Wannsee Conference, held in January of 1942 at a villa outside Berlin, lasted approximately 90 minutes. Senior officials from more than a dozen government and party agencies met to coordinate what was already underway and to clarify the administrative responsibilities for what was being planned. The minutes of that meeting, which survived the war, read like the notes from a project management review. Jurisdictional questions were resolved. Resource allocations were discussed. The word murder does not appear in the document. The thing being managed is referred to in terms so bureaucratic that a reader unfamiliar with the context might assume the subject was a resettlement program or a labor deployment initiative, which was, of course, precisely the intent. But this distance between language and reality, between the official description of an action and what the action actually was not unique to the German side of this war. It was a feature of the war as a whole. Across every theater, among every major power, the machinery of organized killing required a vocabulary that made the killing manageable for the people doing the managing. The Americans called their incendiary bombing campaigns strategic operations. The British called theirs area bombing. The Japanese called their continental expansion a co-prosperity sphere. The Soviets called their mass deportations of ethnic minorities security measures. None of these terms were inaccurate exactly. They were all technically defensible descriptions of real activities. What they shared was a careful avoidance of the language that would make the human cost of the activity impossible to process administratively. Consider what the United States Strategic Bombing Survey found when it examined the results of the air campaigns against Germany and Japan. The survey, which employed hundreds of analysts and produced thousands of pages of detailed findings, was commissioned to determine whether strategic bombing had been effective. It found, among other things, that the bombing of German cities had killed somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians. It found that the firebombing of Japanese cities conducted in the final year of the war had killed somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians in those raids alone, before the atomic bombs. The survey's authors processed these figures professionally. They were weighed against military objectives. They were entered into calculations of cost-effectiveness. They appeared in tables alongside bomb tonnage and aircraft sortie counts and estimated production disruptions. The humans in the figures were already, at the point of analysis, part of a database. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th into March 10th of 1945 killed more people in a single night than any other conventional air raid in history. The specific figure is uncertain, but estimates range from 80,000 to over 100,000 dead in approximately 3 hours. General Curtis LeMay, who planned the raid, had made a series of operational decisions that he understood to be outside the norms of the targeting doctrine that had governed earlier bombing campaigns. He ordered the bombers to fly low at night, without defensive armament, to maximize bomb load. He ordered them to use incendiary rather than high-explosive bombs. He understood that the target area was densely populated residential neighborhoods. He made these decisions because they were militarily effective, and because the institutional culture in which he operated had by that point defined effectiveness as the primary criterion against which decisions were measured. LeMay later said that if the United States had lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal. This statement is frequently quoted as evidence of unusual self-awareness or honesty. What is less often noted is that the statement did not change the decision and did not change any subsequent decision. The raids continued. They expanded. The institutional momentum was too great, the operational logic too well established, for a private acknowledgement of ambiguity to alter the machinery already in motion. This is the nature of institutional systems under wartime pressure. Individual doubt does not interrupt the workflow. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the most discussed events in the entire history of aerial warfare, and they remain genuinely contested on both historical and moral grounds. What is less contested, because it is documented with precision, is the administrative process by which those decisions were made. The target committee that selected Hiroshima and Nagasaki from a list of candidate cities operated with a thoroughness that reflects everything about how this war processed its largest decisions. The committee evaluated potential targets on the basis of their military-industrial value, the probable visual clarity of the skies above them on the target date, the absence of significant numbers of Allied prisoners of war in the area, and the structural characteristics of the urban landscape that would make the blast effects most measurable for post-strike assessment. Hiroshima was selected in part because it had not been heavily bombed previously, which meant that the results of the new weapon could be cleanly evaluated without confounding variables introduced by prior damage. The city was, in a technical sense, a controlled experiment. The committee's meeting notes used precise, professional language throughout. The word civilians does not appear in the selection criteria. The estimated population of the target area appears in one document as a factor contributing to the blast area's scientific utility. The humans in the city are, in these documents, part of the experimental conditions. Approximately 70,000 people died in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Approximately 40,000 died in Nagasaki on August 9th. The after-action reports filed within days were thorough and detailed. They included assessments of structural damage, blast radius measurements, fire spread patterns, and estimated casualty figures. They were processed through the same administrative channels as every other post-strike report in the Pacific Campaign. Across the war, in every theater, the normalization of mass killing proceeded through a series of institutional adaptations that were neither dramatic nor visible from outside the system. The key mechanism was specialization. When an institution breaks a morally significant action into enough component tasks and distributes those tasks among enough people, no single participant is required to hold the full moral weight of the outcome in view. The person who drafted the targeting memorandum was not the person who loaded the bomb. The person who loaded the bomb was not the person who flew the aircraft. The person who flew the aircraft did not see the people below. The person who filed the damage assessment report worked from numbers, not from scenes. Each person in the chain performed a legitimate professional function. The function, at every point in the chain, was describable in terms that made it part of an ordinary working life. This division of moral labor was not invented in the Second World War, but the scale of the war and the industrial organization of its violence pushed the division to a point that had no precedent. The German Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union beginning in June of 1941, operated initially by concentrating on the immediate, direct violence. They shot people in pits and ravines and forests. The psychological effects on the shooters were well documented within the SS system itself. Heinrich Himmler, who oversaw the Einsatzgruppen, observed personally in August of 1941 that the psychological burden of direct killing was creating operational problems. His response was not to stop the killing. His response was to find a more efficient method that would reduce the psychological exposure of the people doing the killing. The result was the development of gas vans and then of the fixed extermination facilities at Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Majdanek. These facilities were designed specifically to industrialize the killing in ways that would make it administratively manageable and psychologically sustainable for the people operating the system. The personnel who operated these facilities were, by all documentation, ordinary people. The historian Christopher Browning's detailed study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, which participated in mass shootings in occupied Poland, found that the men in the unit were middle-aged, working-class Germans with no particular history of violence, no special ideological fanaticism, and no prior selection for the work they were asked to do. When their commander gave them the option to opt out of the shootings without penalty, a small number did. The majority did not. Browning's conclusion, which has been disputed but never effectively refuted, is that the ordinary social dynamics of a work group, the reluctance to appear weak or different, the desire to share the burden with one's colleagues, the normalizing effect of seeing the people around you do a thing, contributed more to participation than any particular ideological commitment. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments in the 1960s, designed in direct response to questions raised by the Nuremberg trials, found that approximately 65% of ordinary American citizens, when placed in an institutional context that framed harm to another person as a legitimate professional requirement, would continue delivering what they believed to be dangerous electric shocks to another person rather than defy an authority figure's instructions. Milgram's findings were disturbing not because they described unusual people, but because they described ordinary ones. The people in his experiments were not cruel. They were not ideologically primed. They were following a process. They were doing what the institutional context told them was the appropriate thing to do. The institutional context of the Second World War told millions of ordinary people across every country involved that the appropriate thing to do was to participate in organized killing on a scale that had no precedent in human history. And they did it. Not universally, not without resistance in many individual cases, not without the psychological damage that this kind of participation produces. But they did it at sufficient scale to sustain the most lethal conflict in recorded history for 6 years. In the Pacific Theater, the violence between Japanese and American forces developed over time, a character that the official histories of both countries have been reluctant to examine in full. The mutual dehumanization that occurred in this theater was not incidental to the fighting. It was a product of it, amplified by institutional decisions and official communications that made it systematic. American military publications during the war regularly used language to describe Japanese soldiers and civilians that has no equivalent in the materials produced for the European theater. The language was openly racial. It appeared not in underground publications or private correspondence, but in official training materials, in newspapers, in magazine articles that were approved by the Office of War Information, in film productions that bore government sanction. This language had operational consequences. The treatment of Japanese prisoners of war by American forces was substantially worse than the treatment of German prisoners. The decision-making that governed the escalating air campaign against Japanese cities in 1945 operated in an institutional environment in which Japanese lives were simply valued differently. The documentation is clear on this point, though the subject is not one that American military historians have engaged with uniformly. The targeting decisions for the incendiary campaign were made in an institutional context in which the destruction of Japanese cities, including their civilian populations, was treated as categorically different from the earlier reluctance to engage in area bombing of German cities. The Japanese military's conduct in China and Southeast Asia, and in its treatment of Allied prisoners of war, documented atrocities on a scale and with a systematic character that were themselves products of institutional decisions at the highest levels of the Japanese command structure. The Nanjing Massacre, which occurred over 6 weeks in late 1937 and early 1938, was not a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was a prolonged series of actions by Japanese military units operating in a command environment that had effectively suspended all constraints on behavior toward the Chinese civilian population and toward Chinese prisoners of war. The documentation of the massacre from Japanese sources, including diaries of Japanese soldiers who participated, records the events with a matter-of-factness that is itself the evidence of normalization. Killing is described in the same registers as marching, eating, and sleeping. It had become part of the routine. The Unit 731 complex in occupied Manchuria conducted biological warfare research using human subjects, including prisoners of war and Chinese civilians, with a thoroughness and systematic organization that required large numbers of personnel, continuous supply chains, substantial infrastructure, and ongoing administrative support. The research program was not a secret within the Japanese military establishment. It was funded, staffed, and supplied through regular channels. The senior officers who knew of its existence and did not report it were not acting against institutional norms. They were acting consistently with an institutional culture that had decided the research was valuable and that its subject population did not have standing to claim protections. When the war ended, the United States government made a deliberate decision to classify the findings of Unit 731 and to grant immunity from prosecution to the researchers and administrators who had conducted the program in exchange for access to the research data. This decision was made at senior levels of the American government and military. The reasoning was straightforwardly utilitarian. The data had value. The Soviet Union was already a rival power. Allowing Soviet prosecutors access to the Unit 731 personnel and research would not serve American interests. The decision was not difficult to make within the institutional framework in which it was made. It was a calculation of strategic advantage, processed through normal channels, approved by appropriate authorities, and kept from public knowledge for decades. The Soviet Union's conduct of the war on the Eastern Front was characterized by forms of violence that operated on a scale difficult to comprehend and that were, in many instances, the product of deliberate institutional decisions rather than uncontrolled events. The Soviet system of discipline within the Red Army included Order 227, issued by Stalin in July of 1942. Which established blocking detachments tasked with shooting Soviet soldiers who retreated without orders. The order was not a measure of last resort proposed under conditions of organizational collapse. It was issued as standard military policy, processed through normal command channels, and implemented by units that were part of the regular organizational structure of the Red Army. The number of Soviet soldiers shot by their own side during the war is estimated at somewhere between 150,000 and over 300,000, depending on the source and methodology. The Soviet deportations of ethnic minorities during the war, which included the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans, the Balkars, the Karachais, the Kalmyks, and other groups, were conducted with logistical thoroughness. The NKVD, the Soviet security apparatus, developed procedures for these deportations that included detailed operational plans, assigned transportation quotas, created processing documentation, and established receiving areas in Central Asia and Siberia. The deportations were carried out quickly and efficiently. The Chechen and Ingush deportation in February and March of 1944 moved approximately 400,000 people in about 2 weeks. The conditions of transport were such that significant numbers died during the journey. The conditions in the receiving areas were such that significant numbers died in the months and years that followed. These deaths were not the objective of the operation as stated in its planning documents. They were, in the language of risk management, an acceptable operational outcome. The German occupation of Soviet territory, which began in June of 1941 and covered an area larger than Western Europe, generated a volume of administrative documentation that has occupied historians for 8 decades and is still not fully processed. The occupation was simultaneously a military campaign, an ideological project, and an economic extraction operation. These 3 functions operated through separate but overlapping administrative structures that often created conflicts and inefficiencies, but that were never in conflict about the fundamental disposability of the local population. The Hunger Plan, developed before the invasion began by the Reich Ministry for Food and Agriculture and the economic planning staff of the Wehrmacht, projected explicitly that the German occupation of the Soviet Union would require the diversion of agricultural production from the local population to German military and civilian needs. The planners estimated that this diversion would result in the starvation of tens of millions of Soviet citizens. This estimate was not a warning. It was a projected outcome that was accepted as a necessary cost of the operation. The planning documents are precise, professional, and methodologically sound by the standards of wartime economic planning. The tens of millions of projected deaths appear in the documents as numbers. The planning process continued normally after producing them. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September of 1941 to January of 1944, produced the deaths of somewhere between 800,000 and over 1 million civilians from starvation, cold, and disease. The German military decision to besiege the city rather than assault it was made partly for strategic reasons and partly because assaulting the city would have been costly in German lives. The alternative, a prolonged siege with the predictable result that the city's population would face mass starvation, was processed as the more efficient option. The food allocation decisions made by Soviet authorities within the besieged city, which prioritized military personnel and essential workers over the general population, produced their own hierarchy of dying. People who could not obtain ration cards, who fell below certain categories of productivity, received allocations that were below subsistence. The records of these allocation decisions exist. They are the records of a functioning bureaucratic system operating under extreme stress, making decisions with mortality outcomes that were entirely predictable and entirely documented. In the German-occupied portions of the Soviet Union, the killing of Jewish populations proceeded through a combination of Einsatzgruppen operations, the actions of order police battalions, the collaboration of local police forces and civilian auxiliaries, and eventually the transportation of remaining populations to the extermination facilities in occupied Poland. The scale of these operations required coordination across multiple administrative agencies. The German civil administration in the occupied Eastern Territories, the SS and police apparatus, the Wehrmacht, the Reich Main Security Office, and the railway system all participated. The railway system's role deserves particular attention because it illustrates with particular clarity how the division of moral labor functioned in practice. The German National Railway, the Reichsbahn, transported millions of people to their deaths in occupied Poland. The railway administrators who managed these transportation operations were, in the main, professional civil servants who had been running railroads before the war and continued to run them through the war. The transportation of Jews, Roma, and other groups to the extermination camps was incorporated into the regular scheduling and billing procedures of the railway system. The trains ran on schedules. The trains were billed to the agencies that requested them at standard passenger rates. The billing was processed through normal accounting procedures. The rolling stock was allocated according to standard operational priority systems. The railway administrators who managed these processes were doing their jobs. Their jobs happened to be a critical component of a system that was killing millions of people. The efficiency of the system was, in a genuine sense, remarkable. The trains ran even when military transportation requirements were pressing. There were internal debates within the German administrative system about whether the transportation of Jewish deportees should be subordinated to military supply requirements, and these debates were resolved repeatedly in ways that maintained the deportation schedule, even at some cost to military efficiency. The ideological commitment to completing the extermination program was strong enough to override ordinary military logistics priorities in case after case. The Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, which was the largest of the German extermination facilities, operated with an administrative precision that is documented in the records that survived the war, and in the testimony of the administrators and personnel who survived to stand trial or give interviews. The complex had an administrative structure, a chain of command, personnel records, payroll, supply requisitions, infrastructure maintenance schedules, and construction projects that continued until the final months of the war. The crematoria were maintained on preventive maintenance schedules. Equipment malfunctions were reported through normal channels and addressed through normal supply and repair processes. The personnel who operated the gas chambers had job classifications and performance evaluations. Rudolf Höss, who served as the commandant of Auschwitz for most of its operational period, provided detailed testimony at Nuremberg and in a memoir written before his execution that describes the administrative challenges of managing the complex. His account is notable for the almost complete absence of the emotional register one might expect. He describes transportation scheduling problems, capacity constraints, personnel shortages, and technical difficulties with the crematoria in the same tone and with the same level of practical concern that a factory manager might use to describe production challenges. The people being killed appear in his account primarily as an operational input. The question of what was being done was not, in his telling, a question he found himself asking. The question was how to do it more efficiently. This is not a unique psychological profile. It is the profile of a certain kind of institutional actor, one who has defined professional identity in terms of competent execution rather than evaluation of objectives. The war produced these actors in enormous numbers across every major participant. The institutional systems of the war were designed, deliberately or through evolutionary pressure, to recruit and promote this kind of actor, because this kind of actor made the systems run. The British conduct of the war in its colonial territories and in its strategic bombing campaign reflects the same institutional dynamics operating in a different context. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, occurred in British-controlled India during wartime conditions that included deliberate policy decisions at the highest levels of the British government. The decision to prioritize the export of rice from Bengal to other parts of the empire, the decision to deny the famine's severity in official communications for months, the decision to refuse international food aid offers, and the decision to deny shipping to import replacement food were all made at senior levels of the British war government. The Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, whose role in these decisions is documented in cabinet minutes and in the communications of the War Cabinet, expressed views about the Indian population that were recorded and have been discussed by historians, though not with the prominence that the subject warrants. The famine was not incidental to wartime conditions. It was substantially a product of wartime policy decisions that were made with full knowledge of their probable consequences. The officials who made these decisions processed them through normal channels, recorded them in normal documentation, and continued their other work. The relationship between the famine deaths and the policy decisions is not speculative. It is established by the documentary record. The RAF Bomber Command's area bombing campaign against German cities, which intensified from 1942 through 1945 under the direction of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, was the most sustained, deliberate targeting of civilian population centers in European history prior to the atomic bombings. Harris was explicit in his internal communications about what the campaign was designed to do. The targeting was not primarily aimed at specific industrial facilities, though industrial targeting provided the official justification in many cases. It was aimed at destroying German cities and breaking civilian morale. The Dresden firebombing in February of 1945, which killed somewhere between 22,000 and over 25,000 people in a city that was not a primary military target, occurred at a point in the war when German military defeat was effectively certain. The operational rationale offered was that Dresden served as a transportation hub for the Eastern Front. The documentation suggests that the raid was also intended to demonstrate Allied air power to the Soviet Union at a moment when the shape of the post-war order was being negotiated. The British government was not, during the war, transparent about the nature of the area bombing campaign. The official language described precision attacks on military and industrial targets. Churchill, who had authorized the campaign and supported it for most of its duration, was notably reluctant to associate himself publicly with its results by the end of the war. Harris, who executed the campaign with consistent energy and conviction, was not awarded a peerage after the war, unlike virtually every other senior British commander. A campaign memorial to Bomber Command was not erected until 2012. The institutional memory of the British government worked, in the decades after the war, to create distance between official responsibility and the documented record of what had been authorized and carried out. The United States Navy's submarine campaign against Japanese shipping is among the least discussed major military operations of the war in the Pacific, in part because its scale and methods are difficult to accommodate in the standard narrative frame. American submarines sank the vast majority of Japan's merchant fleet over the course of the war, including ships transporting food, raw materials, and equipment. They also sank ships transporting Japanese prisoners of war, Allied prisoners being moved between locations, and civilian evacuation vessels. The submarines did not, in most cases, have the ability to distinguish among their targets. They attacked vessels that were participating in the Japanese war economy and logistical system. The incidental killing of Allied prisoners on Japanese transport ships, which occurred on multiple occasions and killed significant numbers of men, was processed by the Navy as an operational cost. The men who died were, in the documentation, a known category of potential loss associated with an effective campaign. The American treatment of Japanese Americans during the war is documented so thoroughly that its broad outlines are no longer seriously disputed, though its full implications continue to be minimized in some institutional contexts. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February of 1942, authorized the forced removal of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from their homes on the West Coast and their detention in internment camps for the duration of the war. The people removed were predominantly American citizens. The legal justification, which survived Supreme Court review at the time, was military necessity. The documentation shows that the military necessity rationale was not supported by the available intelligence, which found no evidence of organized Japanese-American disloyalty, and that racial animus and economic self-interest among West Coast farming interests were significant factors in the decision. The Supreme Court decision in Korematsu v. United States, which upheld the exclusion order in 1944, was formally repudiated by the Supreme Court in 2018 in a case dealing with an entirely different subject. The 1944 decision was formally acknowledged to have been wrong. It had, in the meantime, stood as controlling precedent for 74 years. The internment was processed through normal governmental channels. The orders were drafted, reviewed, signed, and implemented according to standard bureaucratic procedures. The camps were administered by a newly created federal agency, the War Relocation Authority, which maintained records, issued regulations, and processed grievances through normal administrative procedures. The people detained were processed with paperwork. Their property, which many lost permanently, was handled through systems. The entire operation was, from the perspective of the officials who administered it, a management problem, and they managed it. In the European theater, the Allied armies advancing through France and Germany in 1944 and 1945 encountered a series of situations that were not fully described in official communications and were, in some cases, actively suppressed. The liberation of concentration camps produced documentation of conditions that the liberating forces, the military commands, and the governments behind them were immediately aware of. Some of this documentation was used for prosecution purposes. Some of it was publicized deliberately as part of the information campaign about the nature of the Nazi regime. Some of it was processed and filed and did not emerge into public discussion until years or decades later. The behavior of some Allied soldiers in the final stages of the war in Europe, including summary executions of German prisoners and the widespread sexual violence against German women in the areas of Soviet occupation, and to a lesser extent in the areas of Western Allied occupation, was known at command levels and was not systematically prosecuted. The Soviet advance through East Prussia, Pomerania, and into Germany was accompanied by mass rape on a scale that historians estimate at somewhere between 1 and 2 million victims. This was not, in the main, uncontrolled violence by individual soldiers. It occurred with the awareness of Soviet commanders at multiple levels and was not treated as a disciplinary matter requiring systematic response. The documentation within the Soviet military system describes the phenomenon in terms that reflect command awareness without command intervention. The Potsdam Conference in July and August of 1945 produced, among other things, an agreement that the German populations of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary should be transferred to the territory of what remained of Germany. The language of the conference agreement called for transfers to be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. The transfers that followed were not, in the main, orderly or humane. Somewhere between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homes in Eastern Europe in the period from 1944 to 1950. Estimates of the deaths associated with these expulsions range widely, but most serious historical estimates are in the hundreds of thousands, with some estimates substantially higher. The expulsions were conducted by Polish, Czechoslovak, and Hungarian authorities, operating with Soviet backing and with the awareness of the Western Allied powers who had agreed to them at Potsdam. The conference agreement was cited in various contexts as the legal authorization for what followed. The processing of German war criminals at Nuremberg is remembered as a landmark in the development of international law and the principle of individual accountability for crimes against humanity. It was also, when examined in detail, a selective process governed by political calculations that its architects were not entirely unaware of. The Nuremberg prosecutions did not include the Allied bombing campaigns. They did not include the atomic bombings. They did not include the Soviet mass deportations or the Katyn massacre, in which Soviet forces killed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers and intellectuals in the spring of 1940. The Soviets participated in the Nuremberg prosecution, and the Katyn massacre was not addressed as a subject for prosecution. The charges developed at Nuremberg, including crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, were defined and applied by the victorious powers. The laws under which the defendants were prosecuted were, to a significant extent, formulated after the acts they addressed. This ex post facto character of the prosecutions was noted at the time by legal scholars and by the defense attorneys for the accused, and was addressed in the tribunal's proceedings. The tribunal's response, essentially, was that the precedents being set were important enough to justify retrospective application. The reasoning was not without merit, and the precedents that were set had long-term importance. What is also true is that the people who designed the prosecution framework were aware throughout the process of the asymmetric application of the standards being established and proceeded anyway. The occupation of Germany after the war was administered by four powers with very different objectives and methods. The American occupation included a denazification program that was, in its initial conception, intended to identify and remove from positions of influence all persons who had played significant roles in the Nazi regime. In practice, the program processed hundreds of thousands of cases through tribunals that were understaffed, operating under time pressure, and producing outcomes that were increasingly shaped by the Cold War context in which the occupation was taking place. As the Soviet Union became the primary concern of American foreign policy, the pool of Germans who had technical expertise, administrative experience, and institutional knowledge of Soviet capabilities became strategically valuable. Operation Paperclip, which brought German scientists with backgrounds in weapons research and related fields to the United States, was the most visible manifestation of this strategic calculation. The scientists who came to the United States through Paperclip included individuals whose research during the war had been conducted using forced labor from concentration camps, and whose records of direct involvement in these programs were known to American officials. The records were, in some cases, altered or suppressed to make immigration processing possible. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, made explicit decisions to prioritize the strategic value of certain individuals over the requirements of the denazification program and, in some cases, over the requirements of immigration law. Wernher von Braun, who became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the lead developer of the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon, was among the German rocket scientists brought to the United States through programs related to Paperclip. Von Braun had been a member of both the Nazi Party and the SS. His V-2 rocket program had used forced labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where conditions were brutal and thousands died. The post-war American presentation of von Braun focused on his technical contributions and his role in the space program. The institutional decision to prioritize his utility over the circumstances of his wartime work was made deliberately and implemented effectively. The Soviet Union conducted its own parallel program of recruiting German technical experts, including scientists from the rocket and nuclear weapons programs. The Soviets were less selective about the ideological backgrounds of the people they recruited, partly because their security apparatus was capable of managing risks that the American system handled differently, and partly because the Cold War competition for technical advantage was understood by both sides to supersede other considerations. The German chemical industry, which had provided the pesticide Zyklon B used in the gas chambers at Auschwitz and other facilities, resumed normal operations after the war. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that had been among the largest corporations in the world before the war, and whose subsidiaries had operated a synthetic rubber facility adjacent to Auschwitz using prisoner labor, was broken up by the Allied occupation authorities into constituent companies. Most of these companies continued operations. Several became major corporations in the post-war German economy and, eventually, in the global economy. The compensation paid to former forced laborers from IG Farben facilities, including from Auschwitz, was paid decades after the war, in amounts and under processes that were determined by legal proceedings and political negotiations rather than by any institutional acknowledgement of liability. The pharmaceutical and chemical testing conducted on concentration camp prisoners during the war included experiments by German companies on prisoners in Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Natzweiler, and other facilities. These experiments were conducted under contracts with pharmaceutical companies, with the companies providing the experimental compounds and the SS providing the prisoners. The documentation of these arrangements exists in the post-war trial records. The executives of the companies involved were among the defendants in one of the 12 Nuremberg military tribunals conducted after the main Nuremberg trial. Several were convicted. Most received sentences that were served only partially. The companies continued. The question of what Japan knew and when about its emperor's role in the conduct of the war was resolved by the American Occupation Authority in a way that served American strategic interests in the post-war Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, who administered the occupation of Japan, made an early and deliberate decision that Emperor Hirohito would not be prosecuted for his role in the war. MacArthur's reasoning, which was communicated to Washington and accepted, was that prosecution of the emperor would destabilize Japanese society and make the occupation more difficult to administer. The decision was not made on the basis of a legal finding that Hirohito bore no responsibility for the conduct of the war. It was made on the basis of political calculation. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo equivalent of Nuremberg, prosecuted 28 senior Japanese officials and military commanders. None of them was the emperor. The institutional narratives that emerged from the war in each country that participated were shaped deliberately and consistently to serve the political and social needs of the post-war period. In the United States, the dominant narrative was one of necessary victory achieved through sacrifice, with minimal attention to the elements of the American war effort that did not fit that frame. In the United Kingdom, the narrative emphasized resilience and the defense of civilization, with the area bombing campaign receding from public discussion for decades. In France, the narrative of the resistance was constructed and promoted with a thoroughness that produced for a generation a significant overrepresentation of French citizens as participants in resistance activities and a significant underrepresentation of those who collaborated, accommodated, or participated in the deportation of French Jews. In Japan, the narrative of victimhood was built primarily around the atomic bombings, with the conduct of the Japanese military in Asia receiving much less consistent attention in public education and commemoration. In the Soviet Union, the narrative of the Great Patriotic War was constructed as a story of national heroism and sacrifice, with the internal violence of the Soviet system, including the NKVD blocking detachments and the mass deportations, entirely absent from public memory. Germany's post-war reckoning with its history was more thorough than any other participant countries, partly because the scale and documentation of what had happened made avoidance less sustainable, and partly because the institutional structure of the Federal Republic was built by people who understood that a credible reckoning was a precondition for reintegration into the Western Alliance. The process was not linear or complete. The first generation of post-war German legal proceedings against Nazi criminals proceeded slowly and produced limited results. It was not until the 1960s, partly in response to the Eichmann trial in Israel, and partly as a result of generational change within the German legal and political establishment, that more systematic prosecution efforts began. By that point, many of the people most directly responsible for the largest crimes were elderly or dead. Adolf Eichmann, who had administered the logistics of the deportation of Jewish populations to the extermination camps throughout occupied Europe, had lived under a false identity in Argentina from 1950 to 1960. He was captured by Israeli intelligence agents and tried in Jerusalem in 1961. The trial produced what is probably the most concentrated examination in recorded history of how institutional participation in atrocity functions psychologically. Eichmann's defense, and to a considerable extent his apparent genuine self-understanding, was that he had been an official doing a job. He had followed orders. He had processed paperwork. He had arranged transportation. He had done what the system required of him. He had not made the decision to kill. He had made the decisions necessary to move people to places where the decision to kill would be executed by others. Hannah Arendt, who observed the trial and wrote about it, coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe what she saw. The phrase has been debated and qualified extensively since she wrote it. What is not debatable is the quality of ordinariness that characterized Eichmann's professional life. He was not a sadist. He was not a madman. He was a bureaucrat who had found his career home in an apparatus that was processing mass murder, and he had been good at his job. The communication infrastructure that supported the German genocide was ordinary. The telephone networks, the telegraph systems, the postal services, the typewriters and carbon paper, the file cabinets, the internal memo systems, the formal correspondence protocols between agencies. All of these were the standard administrative infrastructure of a modern state in the mid-20th century. They were repurposed, without modification, to coordinate the killing of 6 million Jews, approximately 250,000 Roma, approximately 250,000 disabled people through the T4 euthanasia program, and millions of Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, and political prisoners. The infrastructure required no special adaptation. It was already there. It worked. The T4 euthanasia program, which was the systematic killing of German citizens with physical and mental disabilities, operated from 1939 to 1941 as an official, if secret, state program. It was administered by a special office in Berlin, staffed by medical professionals, and operated through a network of killing centers across Germany and Austria. The professional medical staff who participated in T4 were not, in the main, ideological fanatics. They were physicians, nurses, and administrators who had been recruited into a program that the state had defined as a medical one. The language used to describe the program within the medical profession was the language of compassionate care and the relief of suffering. The patients killed were described as being released from their suffering. The killing was described as treatment. The T4 program was discontinued, or rather officially suspended, in August of 1941, after a public protest by Catholic Bishop Clemens von Galen. The protest attracted attention and created political difficulties for the regime. The suspension of the official program did not end the killing of disabled people in Germany. It shifted the administrative framework and reduced the visibility of the operations. But the underlying practices continued in modified forms throughout the war. The regime's sensitivity to domestic public opinion on this particular issue, at a time when it was conducting far larger mass killing operations with no similar concern for domestic reaction, reflects the specific salience of the disabled German population as a subject of domestic German concern, as distinct from populations that had been defined as entirely outside the circle of concern. The relationship between medicine and state violence in this war extended beyond Germany. Medical institutions in Japan participated in the human experimentation conducted by Unit 731. Medical professionals in the United States administered the institutional systems of the internment camps and made the scientific case for racial classifications that underpinned legal segregation in the military. The Red Cross, which maintained an institutional posture of neutrality and non-involvement during the war, had access to information about the concentration camps that it did not fully act upon, partly out of concern for maintaining access to prisoners of war in German captivity. The institutional calculus that led the Red Cross to prioritize access over disclosure was processed through normal organizational decision-making procedures. The signals intelligence organizations of the Allied powers were decoding significant amounts of German and Japanese communications throughout the war. The breaking of the German Enigma cipher, which provided British and American intelligence with access to German military communications at an operational level, produced intelligence that was used selectively to avoid giving away the fact that the cipher had been broken. Convoys were not always protected when protection would have revealed the intelligence source. There are specific documented cases in which ships and their crews were lost in circumstances where the intelligence existed to protect them because the decision was made that the long-term value of the intelligence source outweighed the immediate cost. The people who made those decisions were professionals doing difficult work under pressure. They processed those decisions and moved on to the next ones. The broader category of decisions about what information to act on and what to suppress extended to the intelligence about the Holocaust itself. By late 1942, the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom had substantial, credible evidence from multiple sources that the German state was engaged in the systematic mass murder of Jewish people in occupied Europe. This evidence was processed by the intelligence establishments of both countries and by their governments. The question of what to do with this knowledge was not simple, and historians continue to debate the constraints on action that existed. What is not in serious dispute is that the governments of both countries made deliberate decisions to limit public disclosure of what they knew, partly out of concern that the scale of the information would be disbelieved, partly out of concern that emphasizing the specific targeting of Jews would complicate the broader war narrative, and partly because taking specific action to address the ongoing killing was not, in the institutional calculus of both governments, a high enough priority to justify diverting resources from other objectives. The War Refugee Board, created by the Roosevelt administration in January of 1944, was established only after Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. presented the President with a report prepared by Treasury Department lawyers documenting in detail the State Department's deliberate obstruction of efforts to rescue Jewish refugees. The report was titled, in its internal version, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. The Treasury lawyers used that language deliberately. The report documented specific instances in which State Department officials had delayed, suppressed, and falsified communications related to rescue efforts. The officials involved were career diplomats operating within an institutional culture that was, in various ways, hostile to Jewish immigration and to the political pressures associated with it. The War Refugee Board, once established, facilitated the rescue of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, primarily through its support for operations in Hungary and Romania. Its creation came 3 years after the systematic killing had begun, and more than a year after the American government had reliable knowledge of what was happening. The War Refugee Board's work was funded largely by private Jewish organizations, not by the United States government. It operated with limited resources, limited cooperation from State Department channels, and limited political backing. It nevertheless accomplished more than the institutional resistance had suggested was possible. The end of the war in Europe came in May of 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Germany. The end of the war in the Pacific came in September of 1945 with the formal surrender of Japan aboard the USS Missouri. The Allied armies had occupied large parts of Europe and the Pacific. The military infrastructure of the war was in the process of dismantlement. The conference tables at Potsdam and Yalta had produced the broad outlines of a post-war order. New borders were being drawn. New governments were being installed. Trials were being organized. Memorials were being planned. The systems that had produced the war were not dismantled. The bureaucratic machinery of state violence was not decommissioned. The institutional knowledge of how to organize mass killing, how to use administrative language to describe it, how to divide moral responsibility among enough participants that no single actor bears an identifiable portion of the outcome, was not lost. It was absorbed. It was adapted. It was preserved in the records and in the careers of the people who had operated it, some of whom continued their careers, and some of whom transitioned to new institutional contexts, where their expertise found new applications. The researchers whose human experimentation programs had advanced weapons development were incorporated into the weapons programs of the victor powers. The intelligence professionals who had developed interrogation techniques and informant networks in occupied territories were incorporated into the intelligence structures of the post-war order. The industrial firms whose production had sustained the killing were recapitalized and resumed manufacturing. The administrative frameworks developed for population management, including registration systems, identification requirements, movement controls, and labor allocation mechanisms, were studied and adapted. The laws of war that the Nuremberg tribunals had articulated, including the prohibitions on targeting civilians, on mistreating prisoners, on conducting aggressive war, and on crimes against humanity, became part of international law. They were incorporated into the Geneva Conventions of 1949. They formed the basis for subsequent international legal instruments. They were, from that point forward, the official standard against which states' conduct in war would be measured. The Korean War began in June of 1950. The bombing campaigns conducted by the United States Air Force over North Korea destroyed virtually every city and major population center in the northern half of the peninsula. The Air Force ran out of significant targets within a year and continued bombing. An estimated 3 to 4 million people died in the war, the majority of them civilians. The armistice was signed in July of 1953. The legal framework established at Nuremberg remained in place. The administrative systems that had organized the industrial killing of the Second World War ended when the war ended. The war ended when the fighting stopped, and the documents were signed. The documents were processed through the appropriate channels. The files were closed.